Hi, I'm Paul Chapman, the Executive Director of the Nanaimo and Area Land Trust and the Chair of the Vancouver Island Water Stewardship Symposia Series.
And I'm Kim Stevens, Executive Director, the Partnership for Water Sustainability in British Columbia. And the Symposia Series is a program under the umbrella of the Georgia Basin Interregional Education Initiative.
Welcome to the final module in Watershed Moments, the video trilogy series. We are speaking to you from the territory of the Nanaimo people. In the first two modules, you learned about our interregional collaboration, actionable visions, and how ecological assets, that is our creek sheds, support core municipal services. This week, you will learn why the iconic salmon is the canary in the coal mine and what this means for all of us in an interconnected world. Our theme is, what happens on the land, what we do on the land, does matter. Kim, what is the International Year of the Salmon?
It is a multi-year program, and it has the potential to be a game changer. A game changer because of federal and provincial commitment. And that is why we pose the question, will lightning strike twice? Will we see a repeat of what happened in the 1990s? It is not just about the fish, it is about humankind creating sustainable landscapes for people and salmon. And looking through the salmon lens reminds us of the critical requirement, and I wish to really emphasize this point, for reconnection between federal and provincial government agencies to collaborate in undertaking a challenging mission for which they share authority.
How would you distill the overarching theme for this third and final module?
Well, Paul, it is the interconnectedness of people and environment. It is also very much about mission possible. Drawing on the insights that they gained through their 3+ decades of research experience, Kim Hyatt and Peter Tschaplinski provide context for the situation that we face today. They set the stage for a pragmatic approach to the mission possible part, and that is what next and how we can get there.
In summary, I think the importance here is that the Year of the Salmon indicates an alignment of senior levels of government with the stewardship sector and local government focused on water stewardship. Although we live in an altered landscape of degradation by 1,000 cuts, we can change our path and begin to restore and rebalance our altered world through thousands of acts big and small.
Welcome. My name is Richard Bose. I'm here in Hunter Park in the district of North Vancouver alongside the bank of Hastings Creek. I'm very proud and happy to share this place with you, as it's a place that I've grown up and I've worked in for my entire life. As moderator for this virtual Watershed series, you are going to determine your own course of success. The series was designed to produce technical information, give you background on some of the innovative collaboration happening around the district, and talk about some of the new and emerging trends in natural assets and community services municipalities provide. It's up to you to take whatever resonates with you from this series and choose what you want to do with it.
Good day. By way of introduction, I'm Kim Hyatt. I'm a transplanted farm boy who came to BC from Ontario 50 years ago. As you can see from the background, I live here on Hammond Bay. I love the water. I've been in this house and on Hammond Bay for 40 years, and I'm very glad to be here today. By training, I'm an aquatic ecologist. By experience, I'm an aquatic ecologist who works on issues of salmon life history, their sustainability, and their connections to water, marine ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems, and people. As an applied scientist, I apply my expertise to solve problems that will contribute to the sustainable management of wild salmon, water, and their connections to people for the benefit of us all. Some of my earliest recollections of a child were my attraction to water and the fascinating critters that are in it. Just so many mysteries about how they're connected, how they behave, why they're so different from us, and why they matter to us. And so I was curious about this and interested in solving questions that at the time had no answer, and that put me on the track to become the research scientist that I am. Working on the mysteries of nature, particularly of water, salmon and their connections to it and their connections to people. The outcomes that I'd like to see as a scientist are to solve some of the mysteries about how we better manage natural resources in a sustainable fashion for the benefit of ourselves and the natural world that we're embedded in. I've tried to be a leader as a scientist, but one of the things I've learned that's very profound is that in our country, and given the form of government we have, leadership actually emanates mostly from the bottom. There's no sense in asking me to lead the charge, because the charge has to be led by each of you. Each of you need to stay connected with nature, connected with your political system and beliefs, and put those into practice so that we can achieve the outcomes of sustainable natural resource management and human cultures that we so badly wish to have.
Hello, I'm Peter Tschaplinski, here on the shoreline of beautiful Thetis Lake in Victoria, BC, where I live. I've been a resident of southern Vancouver Island since 1978, and I began my time here earning a PhD from the University of Victoria in coho salmon ecology. I still enjoy working on fish and fish habitat, but away from work, I enjoy hiking, bird watching, nature photography, and as a private pilot, I have a passion for aviation. In my PhD work, I began with a fascination for coho salmon, their diverse life histories, their resilience, and their adaptability. I soon learned that the habitat for coho was the product of processes and linkages from the hill slopes, the valley bottoms, to the streamside areas, and finally to the habitats where they lived. This inspired me to look more deeply into these linkages, how they worked, how they were maintained, and how they were disrupted, using the knowledge to apply to practical solutions to problems such as habitat restoration. For me, to have a conversation with enthusiastic and energetic people interested in Pacific salmon habitat, and habitat restoration, I'm looking forward to sharing an appreciation that the condition and function of the habitat you can see at your feet is the outcome of important watershed connections, hydrological connections, extending from the smallest tributaries on hill slopes down to the mainstream channel. This knowledge is so important. It informs sound assessments, which in turn informs good planning and can only lead to the implementation of effective restoration actions. And in the end, what is good in a watershed for Pacific salmon is also good for people.
Hello, my name's Nick Leone. I'm a resident of Nanaimo, BC, and I'm here in Bowen Park on the lower Millstone River. And I'm a fisheries biologist and was fortunate enough to be able to join Fisheries and Oceans and worked many years within the BC interior before moving over to Vancouver Island, where I currently reside. I work within the resource restoration program that is focused on the restoration of aquatic ecosystems with a focus specifically on Pacific salmon. I think I got into this field like many did, with a natural curiosity and interest in the natural environment, and later on, particularly salmon. And I think my focus on salmon and fascination is that they're a very unique species and have a very unique and diverse life history. Combining the fresh water with the marine environment. It's a species that are iconic to public, and I think That's really a real focus and passion for me, is that salmon bring together the natural landscape with people. And I find real value and purpose in terms of working with people to look after salmon as a species and their environment and what that means for us.
And I'm Neil Goeller, and I live here in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island as well. I'm a hydrologist and geomorphologist. I started my career in consulting in Victoria. I've been working for the better part of 15 years in water resources and terrain hazards. I moved to the Okanagan to work for the provincial government as an expert in hydrology, and eventually to Nanaimo. And presently I oversee the hydrometric networks of BC in both surface and groundwater. What I love about hydrology and geomorphology is the study of landscapes and how they form. And I have a never-ending interest in looking at river valleys, at mountains and so on, and thinking about how the glaciers and the rivers have shaped them over time. And hydrology and geomorphology give you the opportunity to study how the world, or at least the surface of the earth, is shaped and formed by water, glaciers, and so on. Through my opportunities with the provincial government, I get to study those processes, think about why they happen and how we can produce information to inform better management of our resources and better management of the landscape. In my job, I study a lot of that, and especially separating out the human impacts from the natural impacts, both at a broader scale through climate change and also just development at the local scale. And also the opportunity to work with the public in education and outreach to try and inform people who are also similarly passionate about the environment and help them to find ways in which they can pursue their goals and they can fight for the causes that they feel passionate about. We've definitely faced some new challenges in organizing this conference in the face of the pandemic and achieving the objectives of connecting people with knowledge, but also of connecting people with people. And the challenge of bringing people together when we can't meet face-to-face is a big one. And I think out of this conference, the hope is to connect people and motivate them to contact the people that they're most interested in talking to and they think will help their causes back in their regions and start to mobilize and cooperate as groups to help push these initiatives forward.
I agree. This basically represents a somewhat different platform for folks to learn, understand, and educate and to share ideas. And also a different way for outreach for government entities as well to engage public members. And I'm very hopeful that this type of series will evolve over time and will support those efforts over the course of time. So I'm very optimistic.
Communities could build on what some have known since the 1980s, and in doing so, offset the neglect of past decades. At every scale, there are challenges and solutions that are going to need to be embraced. We have the thinking figured out. We can take lessons learned and bring them back to our regional and local context, and inspire people to do better.
In British Columbia, the iconic salmon is our canary in the coal mine. Some of our audience will recall how the salmon crisis of the 1990s galvanized federal and provincial action, including cross-border collaboration, new and pioneering research into the life cycle of the salmon. Will lightning strike twice? And inspire a new generation of researchers, managers, conservationists to take the baton, collaborate, and make change. For the first time in decades, the stars are in alignment. Our federal and provincial governments have committed both money and time to the International Year of the Salmon. This program has grown into an effort to ensure the resilience of both salmon and people in our wonderful country. The multi-year program represents a once-in-a-generation moment. Does it give you hope to learn that this shows a renewed interest, commitment, and timely re-engagement by our senior government? With the International Year of the Salmon, as a guiding vision, communities can build on what some of us have known since the 1980s, and in so doing, offset the neglect of past decades. We can follow through with an effective response this time and truly reconnect hydrology and ecology. Success will depend on the application of science-based understanding, or what we know, harnessed to political will to make it happen. Today's conversation is in two parts. First, Kim Hyatt and Peter Tschaplinski will synthesize the key information that will help guide decision-making. They will connect the dots between four key theme areas. Next, Nick Leone and Neil Goeller will then join Kim and Peter for a roundtable discussion.
Richard has introduced the concept of International Year of the Salmon. And he's identified that International Year of the Salmon has an objective of accelerating our understanding from a research perspective and from a applied management perspective and a conservationist perspective of why salmon are important and what the linkages are between salmon and people. One can pose the question of what difference would it make? Salmon and people have connections that have developed over millennia of time. Since the last glacial retreat, human populations and salmon populations in the North Temperate Zone around the Atlantic and Pacific Basin have both come to occupy the verdant ecosystems of river valley bottoms and depend critically on ecosystem services for the viability and biodiversity of both human culture and of salmon populations throughout their range. Salmon are a key component of these ecosystems. Salmon influence ecosystems, ecosystems influence salmon, and human populations influence both. We are both post-glacial colonists. We're both highly resilient populations. But one of the big differences between salmon and people is that salmon don't degrade ecosystem services, whereas human populations have had an impact on the global environment to the point at which they become one of the dominant forces in shaping ecosystems. If people wish to maintain salmon as part of their social, economic, and cultural fabric, then humans have to take it upon themselves to sustain those ecosystems and understand deeply what is required to sustain salmon within those ecosystems. Salmon within ecosystems have huge impacts on the biodiversity around us. They influence nutrient transfer, they influence the persistence of a wide range of species that are salmon dependent, and they unite the great pastures of the North Pacific Ocean with the nutrient-poor watersheds of landscapes that humans occupy. This linkage and the importance of this linkage cannot be underestimated. First Nations peoples understood this in a spiritual and cultural sense and have deeply rooted connections with salmon. Adopted colonists like myself who have come to British Columbia have come to understand the importance and the critical role that salmon play and have largely embraced the First Nations view of the sacred nature and the importance of salmon in sustaining ecosystems. So salmon and people both rely on landscapes and the broad forest ecosystems that cover those landscapes. And my colleague Peter Tschaplinski has spent much of his career studying those landscapes and how they control ecosystem processes that support both human populations and salmon populations. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'd like to move from the global scale down to the regional and local to talk about ecosystems and salmon habitat. Ecosystem function is the product of watershed level linkages between the hill slopes and valley bottoms, from the valley bottoms to the stream side or riparian areas, ultimately to the stream channel network. These components are all part of a watershed, and the watershed context is key for understanding salmon habitat, what creates it, and what maintains it. These components of a watershed are stitched together by the stream channel network. And the stream channel network is highly dependent upon the hydrologic cycle. Vegetation structure, cover, especially in forested landscapes, is key for the hydrologic cycle and all of these linkages within watersheds. Vegetation structure, say in forested landscapes, are important for intercepting precipitation, slowing rainfall on its way to the ground, allowing for groundwater infiltration, and slowing the rate of runoff downslope to the stream channel. This is all about peak flow moderation, the reduction of the potential for erosion and other physical disturbances to the stream channel network. Vegetation structure is beneficial for salmon, salmon friendly, and also beneficial for humans. Vegetation structure in streamside areas or riparian areas is also critically important for salmon habitat. Water temperature control, moderation, is a function of intact riparian vegetation. This will be particularly important in the future as our climate warms. Salmon have particular tolerances and preferences of temperature. When temperatures approach 20 degrees Celsius, we have trouble. Not only is streamside vegetation structure an important moderator of aquatic temperatures, the thermal regime, but the forest also supplies key elements in support of biological productivity. Nutrients, small organic materials for the food webs and streams that support salmon directly. Also, streamside vegetation supports large wood, which in low gradient streams that salmon thrive in, large wood is important for habitat complexity, habitat structure, and stream channel and bank stability. Over the last 50 to 100 years, we have had great conversion of our landscapes for human use. Urban areas are a prime example of how we've converted our landscapes. So with this alone, human impacts on watersheds, salmon habitat, and salmon are profound. Moving into a discussion on human impacts. We have a profound effect on ecosystems, ecosystem processes, and function. A lot of our activities have interrupted the connections within watersheds from the hill slopes to the stream channel. When these connections are intact, we have the situation that is ideal for the creation and maintenance of salmon habitat. When they're interrupted, this is the source of a great deal of our problems with sustaining salmon in freshwater. My colleague Kim Hyatt mentioned that watersheds and salmon affect each other. Humans affect both. We have a big impact because there are so many of us, but we're also part of the ecosystem too. We share our space with other species, including Pacific salmon. There are a few watersheds in British Columbia that are without some kind of human-related effect on them, few if any. Our effects range from urban developments to agriculture, to forestry and other resource development activities. Depending upon the watershed size, we'll have these developments and activities occurring alone or in various combinations, and the outcomes will reflect this combination. Also important is the size of the watershed, where it is, its topography, the steepness of its terrain, climatic conditions, and a multitude of other factors. Today, we're left with some historic effects of human developments and activities. Activities and practices that are long obsolete, but their effects are still with us. One example is the lack of large structural wood in streams that are important for salmon. Another is our infrastructure used to regulate water and to have water available for human withdrawal. The issue of water for humans and water for salmon has always been with us and will get more acute with changing climate. Now, with all of these things on the landscape, there are ample opportunities for restoration. And when we approach restoration, the watershed context is key. And when we look at a watershed, we should integrate across all human activities in that watershed so that our actions are effective. Good assessments, good planning lead to good restorative actions, actions that will have a higher likelihood of success. Create the conditions for resiliency. Build resiliency by looking at the connection in watersheds that is the function of the stream channel network, the hydrological cycle, and the flow of water from the headwaters to the mouth of the outlet stream. Don't always focus on big projects. A lot of small actions and activities together are meaningful. They're cumulative. And there are a lot of things we can do. We can reconnect salmon with their habitats, reconnect those places within a drainage basin, within a watershed, where salmon can no longer access habitats they historically had access to, such as stream crossings that fail to pass fish effectively. If the habitat upstream, for example, of a road stream crossing is in good shape, that could be a place for a quick win, where the fish can have access to the habitat with little other input required. If the habitat is upstream is affected, then restorative action to those upstream reaches should be part of the plan. Sediment input into our salmon habitats is a widespread issue. Sediment control should be part of how we approach restoring salmon habitat. And just maintaining our roads, our road stream crossings, our ditches, and other sources of chronic sediment are important considerations. We shouldn't expect our watershed restoration treatments to result in a return to pristine conditions, to before the human imprint on our landscapes are what they are today. Nevertheless, productive salmon habitats are still possible and are still fully in scope. We have to prioritize, however, and some of that prioritization will have to have the long view look on how conditions will evolve and change under the lens of our changing climate. But it is also important to prioritize. Do your watershed restoration where you'll get the biggest return for your effort. And under the lens of climate is an important consideration, and I turn it over to my colleague, Kim Hyatt, to further the discussion on climate change.
Thank you, Peter. So, humankind, from a global scale to a regional scale, is engaged in probably our most challenging experiment over our entire evolutionary history. I read a paper probably 20, 25 years ago, which was a revelation to me. And the paper was by a set of physical scientists who said for the first time, this was a paper published in Science magazine, said for the first time in human history, the activities of human populations on planet Earth had overtaken all geological forces, wind erosion, rain erosion, earthquake, landslides, as the major force reshaping the surface of planet Earth. So to put this in context, we are engaged in an unprecedented reworking of ecosystems. In the past, human populations have always been able to go to a new frontier when we ran out of ecosystem services. There are no new frontiers for us to now exploit. And so the challenge ahead is to see whether or not we can design with nature to maintain ecosystem services for ourselves. Now, what's this got to do with salmon? Well, salmon rely on those same ecosystem services, and if we can sustain ecosystem services for salmon, then it is very likely that we will also be able to sustain and wisely engineer planet Earth for sustainable human populations for millennia to come. One of the largest experiments that we now have launched, of course, is climate change. Climate change will influence every geophysical process, biophysical process that salmon and human populations currently rely on. Salmon, with their complex life histories, will be influenced at each life history stage in a series of hierarchical critical habitats from the high seas to headwater streams where they spawn. And so, because these processes will change, and it's impossible to predict precisely when, where, and to what extent they'll exchange, we will have to adaptively manage going into the future to try and mitigate for the impacts of climate change, but also to adapt to those changes which are now essentially unleashed and irreversible. So human populations and salmon populations will face this challenge together. The advantage that we have, of course, is that we're sentient beings with a rich history of deep understanding of not only our own place in ecosystems, but also the place that other creatures like salmon occupy. And so it's that kind of future that we have to design for and to ensure the sustainability of. I think that's probably as much as I would say at a global scale. At a regional scale, the explicit changes that we can expect to see are increased warming. We've had about 1.3 degrees Celsius warming in the past century in our own region. We're anticipating 2 to 4 degrees of additional warming over the next century. This will put human populations and salmon populations in very challenging situations, particularly on the southern end of the range, but also throughout the range. The oceans are warming and acidifying, and the productive capacity of those oceans to sustain salmon and sustain the ecosystem services that broadly support both human populations and salmon will also be something that we need to deeply understand and adapt to and mitigate for, if at all possible.
Hi, this is Richard Bose. I'm back again with some colleagues and friends On my far right is Neil Goeller. Immediately on my right is Kim Hyatt. On my immediate left is Peter Tschaplinski, and then we have Nick Leone. And we're going to undertake to have a discussion. We've heard a little bit about the importance of the Year of the Salmon. Neil and the rest of our group will talk a little bit about all of these issues around how are we linking salmon, what we know, what we don't know, human impacts, ecosystem functions, climate change, vegetation, all of these components that we know are important to salmon. We're going to have a discussion around this issue and what things we might want to do, changes, what can happen, and some ideas that are going to come out with that. Actually, we might help you make some changes in some of the decisions you're planning to make. Neil, why don't we start with some of you and some of your input?
Well, the first thing I was going to bring up was that you know, in terms of the complexity around the room, we have all the different disciplines, myself pretending to be a hydrologist, but these other biologists, that to have an appreciation for having an understanding of natural systems and how they behave and how they interconnect ahead of our management of those systems, and in particular the damage and other things that happen through development and that sort of thing. So we can't really manage a system very effectively until we understand how it operates, how it behaves, and how those different components that are within that system in terms of the fish, the water, the groundwater, and so on, interact with each other to create the natural system that exists.
Now that said, Neil, we will never live in a world with perfect knowledge. And so we have to make best use of the knowledge that we do have, to take calculated risks, to use all of the understanding that we do have to make prudent judgments about what kinds of developmental decisions and sustainable management processes we should have in place. Too often the lack of perfect knowledge becomes an impediment. It actually paralyzes us from making decisions and going ahead. And so on the one hand, yes, we need to seek a deeper understanding, but on the other hand, we can't just sit and wait for perfect knowledge before we act. We have to manage the systems that we have in place, and that means tinkering with them intelligently, using every bit of knowledge we have to stack the deck for making the right decisions in terms of sustainable resource management.
And I would agree with you on that point, Kim. I think it's in part moving on that theme, appreciating or respecting the things that we actually do know about the landscapes and the linkage between the landscapes and fish and ourselves, and the things that we don't know. We can also learn from our past experiences and bring those forwards. We have a number of examples of meaningful lessons learned that we can carry forward with us now that we better appreciate in terms of looking back. The things that we've learned over time about how these systems function, their contribution to the support of salmon populations, and fundamentally our influence on those systems and those fish populations. So it's in a sense, we need kind of all hands on deck in terms of engagement from the different government institutions, society, the conservation group interests, and clearly indigenous communities have taught us a significant amount in regards to these fundamental relationships and linkages that Peter was speaking to earlier and talking about the ecology. So I think there's a lot we can bring forward. We still obviously have a long way to go, but we do have to kind of temper, as you've noted, again, appreciating that we don't have all the information that we need, and we still need to, in a sense, manage real time.
I agree completely with what's been said to this point. I'd like to add that although we don't know everything, we do know a considerable amount about what fish need in fresh water, what makes good habitat. You know, it's sometimes can be boiled down relatively simple. You know, sticks, rocks, and water. But, you know, it's not to be facetious, but we know that, you know, sediment is something really important to salmon habitat. In the right amounts, it's what makes the stream bed. It's what makes the spawning habitat. It's what is needed to supply a source of aquatic food organisms for fish. What is needed in low gradient streams for habitat complexity and structure, for the creation of deeper pools and shallower riffles. And of course, water is fundamental. And all of these things in the right amounts over the right periods of time. Where we run into trouble is where the sediment supply is affected by our actions on the landscape. Often there's too much of it. So, you know, all streams, however, do need a supply of sediment. Because of the action of water over long periods of time, the stream bed has moved downslope. It needs to be replaced over a long period of time at approximately the same rate. Where we get in trouble is with big episodic inputs of sediment through either landslides, other failures, or chronic supplies of fine sediment. We know what we should do to limit the input of both of those things so that we have sediment in streams within the natural range of variation that we're well familiar with. And the same can be said for wood. We also know what we need in regard to the streamside or riparian forest. We understand the importance of it to the biological processes of the stream, to how it supports the ecology, and ultimately the salmon. So some things we do know that we can manage for in our various developments to make sure these pieces are in place.
So Neil and Peter talked a lot about the relationships of science and salmon and the need to understand these scientific relationships so that we make good and right change. Kim and Nick talked a little bit about, well, we know quite a lot, certainly enough to make progress. So one of the things now I want to hear a little bit more about is climate change. Climate change creates a lot of apprehension, a lot of nervousness around, I think we could be doing this, but we don't know what climate change is going to do. So what are some ways of keeping climate change in mind and talking about making some of these changes that we have a pretty good degree of confidence that will be resilient when facing climate change?
So one of the things that we can do is to harness the kind of analytical capability we have to improve the kind of forward projections that we need to be able to make to do risk assessments on landscapes, ecosystems, and salmon populations. British Columbia is a topographically really heterogeneous region, climatically a really heterogeneous region. Obviously, if you've been living in Rupert this summer versus Vancouver, your summer's been a totally different picture. And if you live in the southern interior versus the outer coast, again, it's a rather different picture, particularly in the wintertime. So because of that heterogeneity, it means that climate change will not alter the processes and the sustainability of salmon populations equally, even within subregions. And so one of the big challenges we face is to use the interdisciplinary expertise we have from climatologists and hydrologists in combination with the expertise we have in the life history of salmon and what is required for the sustainability to do risk assessments to actually map the future projection of risk for salmon populations, for those that can be maintained, for those that can't be maintained, and for those that may actually be enhanced. Currently, we do not have such a map, but we have the capability, we have enough knowledge and expertise to create such things. So, that's one of the directions that science will need to go forward with in order to inform sustainable management.
And I think further to that point, I think it's, again, respecting the need for interdisciplinary nature approach to better understanding the conditions and health of our watersheds, the species that utilize those watersheds, and I'm talking all species in this case, and making sure that we have an understanding of those linkages and how they've been transformed as we see climate change impacts, because there certainly has been. Those changes are manifested in many different ways, as was spoken about a bit earlier, certainly globally, regionally, and even down to a local level. And I think it's trying to gain a better understanding or appreciation for those impacts and what that means for a number of things. What that means for our management systems in terms of being able to look at our current forms of development and land use planning, and how we may make some adjustments over time that reflect and better address those effects of climate change. And from a restorative level is to consider those changes and what that may look like in trajecting 25, 50, 100 years down the road, as Kim was suggesting, and to better inform some of the actions that we take on a restorative level. It seems pretty certain that the issue around water supply and availability, the effects on water temperature, the thermal regime, and even water quality factors will continue to adjust or shift over time. And one of the things we do know is we have a species in Pacific salmon, or a group of species, that is highly adaptable and is attempting to adapt, if you will, real time, as they have over the last 10,000 years, to make adjustments to those environments. But we can't presuppose necessarily what that may look like. And I think taking a multidisciplinary approach, as well as one that considers the natural process elements of how watersheds function and the linkages that Peter spoke to earlier, that is a very important part of the equation.
Further to Nick's comments, we're focused a great deal on temperature changes as one of the things that we can expect from a changing climate. But precipitation regime changes are also going to occur. And they're going to be on a regional, even a sub-regional basis. The multidisciplinary approach is really important because these are two different kinds of processes or conditions that will be together for an entire year's worth of effect on freshwater ecosystems and salmon. For example, on the coast, we can expect more frequent storms, more severe storms, runoff that could affect human infrastructure and fish habitat. There very well could be mass movements of materials, landslide increased frequency, affecting streams and fish habitat, and they'll affect human infrastructure too. Being aware of this potential will be not only good for salmon, but good for people. But in other places, we'll have a different dynamic. We'll have, for example, back to temperature, in places where watersheds are dominated by snowmelt will occur earlier in the season. Your runoff will be earlier. What's left for the rest of the summer, from summer right through to autumn? Potentially more drought, warmer water, less water, with the obvious impacts on fish.
And Peter, those are good points. And from that perspective, that sounds like a hydrologist, linked to a hydrologist and some of the considerations or concerns there. Just wondering if Neil might have anything to speak to on that front,
Never.
being
Well,
the resident hydrologist.
I think a big challenge is that variability, the spatial, the temporal, the time scale over which some of these changes are going to occur, and the degree of variability we're going to see in some of these processes over time. You're going to find communities that are going to be a bit trapped where they're relying on a single, say, glacial melt to prop themselves up in the summer. And in the cases where the processes that they rely on to supply them with a resource is going to be, changed forever in the face of climate change. But also adjusting to things on the scale at which things are, the rate at which these processes are going to change and the scale of change. And we talk about stream temperature, we talk about flows, the distribution of flows, the timing of storms and the intensity of storms. All of those things become problems for management of the resource naturally, but also for where people live, how they interact with the land, and what becomes safe and unsafe. But it's sort of an external, almost seen as inevitable destination at this point, but within that there's a great degree of flexibility, and there's a certain amount of understanding of the processes, there's a certain amount of understanding in the predictions, but there's also a great deal of uncertainty in terms of the interaction of those processes and how, as things change, especially in the greater extremes, how they will interact to shape the future of climate, the future of those resources. And can we build the resilience in, or will we see something more along the lines of an ecosystem collapse and reestablishment, where you have ecosystems that are maybe you guys are more the ones to speak to this, but that the intricate linkages in the ecosystem are not resilient to climate change as a whole system. And maybe the system will have to be reestablished, or maybe they can adjust and change over time. But maybe that's an issue of the scale over which those changes occur, the time.
Well, certainly one of the things that Fisheries and Oceans as an agency has, from a science and policy perspective, has begun to act on. Aldo Leopold, who is a seminal ecologist in terms of offering wisdom about managing landscapes, said a couple of things that resonate with me. One was that first you should save all the pieces, because we don't have deep enough understanding to know how those pieces actually operate within processes. But the pieces are really important. If you give up key pieces, you just don't have them to work with anymore. And then the second thing was, because we don't understand how all those pieces operate together, we should try and tinker intelligently. So we're conducting experiments all the time. We can't guarantee outcomes, but one of the things that we can do is to try and develop resilient management processes that increase our odds of being able to manage the outcomes towards a sustainable future. So in the case of wild salmon, one of the things the department has done is to dig deep and define the genetic and ecotypic diversity that salmon represent. So although there are 15,000 populations of wild salmon locally in British Columbia, there are approximately 400 plus conservation units that have these unique genetic and ecotypic characteristics. So the department has shifted to managing for those conservation units in the fullness of time. I mean, that was a change that was implemented in 2005. And it's only beginning to gain traction in terms of understanding how to save all of the pieces of wild salmon as an insurance policy against things that we don't control, like the impacts of climate change. We'll need all of that genetic diversity, and we'll need to be able to use that material to try and restore resiliency for salmon-dependent ecosystems in the future. So that's just a small example focused on salmon to illustrate some of these points.
Before we get on to more of this discussion, I got a really interesting point that I think came out. You, Kim, described about the heterogeneity of the province. Nick talked about the importance of interdisciplinary teams in working together to get a broader understanding. And given the geographical challenges of our province, I can't help but think how important local knowledge, cultural history, local knowledge, and the knowledge that these integrated teams derive from the local group, the local streamkeeper groups that have been working on a watershed for a long time, they seem to be really becoming more and more important as our organizations attempt to reach out and do more work across such varied terrain. So I thought that was a really important point. As I can't help but think too, Neil, groundwater hydrology, it's such a highly specialized field, but yet rather than wait on collecting data and equipment all over the place, maybe we find a way to rely on local knowledge and input from people that have been living in that watershed for a long time, work together, find some solutions, and help things out. So I know we've been trying to do that. So let's talk now a little bit about sort of maybe some of the physical things. That seems to be your expertise. Human impacts, things that are physically affecting the salmon population, and things that the everyday person in the audience might look at and not know a lot about now. You talked a lot about sediment, the importance of sediment. Just enough is good, too much is bad. So, what about some human impact?
Indeed. And there are cases where there's not enough. Sediment mobilization and transport is an important natural process. It can be disturbed by certain things we do on the landscape. We can result in putting a lot in, or we can also put in a lot of woody debris that could cause temporary log jams, for example. And where you've got this situation occurring, you'd have a buildup of sediment upstream because it's intercepting the downstream movement, but a scour immediately below. So the water is still moving sediment downstream. So you could get a bony boulder and heavy, large cobble channel below, which would lack spawning gravel. These are kinds of things that you look for when you're thinking about habitat restoration. Now, these are temporary features, part of the evolution sometimes of fish habitat, because these debris flows and deposits can happen naturally all over the place. We tend to accelerate them, or have done so historically, less so now. But we should also look to what the effects of climate change may be, because we could see an acceleration of the rate of landslides as a result of more frequent high precipitation events and delivery of materials to channels. So that certainly would be something that we need to keep in mind when planning for future infrastructure. What is harmful to fish is also harmful to people when we're looking at channel disturbances and the potential effects of storm flows. But returning to temperature, salmon have a certain range of tolerance and preference that could well be exceeded in some parts of our province without at least some mitigative action. To pay attention to our streamside ecosystems. Streamside shade, for example, will help. But there will be some places in BC where, because of changes in temperature, we might expect changes in the distribution of salmon. Where drought will be an issue and high temperatures, a component of those changes, we'll have some challenges in mitigating those effects. Other places in BC, because we're looking at regional variations in the effect of climate change, we might even see some range expansions, where in watersheds currently on the cool side for salmon productivity, you might have conditions that in fact are improved. Some of this could happen in the northerly regions of the province. So our adaptation to climate change, our preparation for it, and our mitigation of what we can expect will depend upon what we can expect on a regional basis. And that goes back to Kim's comments on the need for better predictive tools so that we can adapt to these changes as they vary across the landscape and geographically.
If I can just maybe add to that briefly here, I think it really is taking stock and understanding in terms of around the human needs, the need for water, the need for resources, how we fundamentally utilize the landscape. And in so doing, we have an effect, certainly an effect on these natural ecological processes that shape the ecology of any watershed, and very importantly, the hydrology of that watershed and the fish habitat that we see that supports the diversity of populations. So it really is important to understand that we have these kind of effects, and any given form of land use has a range of particular effects relative to the practices, and we need to consider that in terms of land use planning as we look forward, but also in terms of evaluating the potential for effective restorative actions in these watersheds. Because you have to have a clear understanding of the impacts, how that's affecting the natural processes, where those particular deficiencies may be in the case of salmon that are highly dependent and seasonally based in terms of their life history. What changes are we seeing trending? And are they trending in a negative way? And what interventions may we be able to introduce to reestablish some of the natural process, the rates of process in terms of flow? We're talking about timing of flows, sediment delivery, large woody debris, the evolution of riparian stand structure, which is so critical. A lot of our riparian stands these days are more even-aged stands, as formerly we had greater complexity within those environments. But these are the core linkages within the watersheds that produce the nature, type, and quality of habitats and environments that we see in these watersheds. And they can obviously support and enhance fish populations, but there are a number of other ecosystem services that are provided to society that are highly beneficial in having intact watersheds. And once again, and part of the theme here is that salmon are a key and sentinel species in terms of giving society a sense of how well are we doing? How well is our environment doing? If we start to see declines, persistent declines in any one population or a group of populations over several species, to some of the points that Kim was making earlier, I think it's a pretty good indicator that we're not trending in the right way. And we need to accordingly make the kinds of adjustments that we're talking about. So, and in so doing, one other comment I would add to the point that you've raised, Richard, is that it really is important to have the different sectors in society engaged in managing this issue. We got here as a function of that, and to find improvements and looking forward and with some positive outcomes, we need obviously to work together. That's where the issue around the interdisciplinary nature comes in terms of specific science disciplines to support our work, our restorative efforts, but as well in working with governments and working with indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are working with local governments and broader level of governments, the local conservation authorities and interest and stewardship groups. So I think everyone fundamentally has a role and a contribution to play.
So the land we've heard the land is linked to salmon and healthy salmon populations. In particular, the vegetation and the cover on the land. Peter, you talked about the importance of woody debris. That comes from the vegetation on the land. How about the vegetation and changes we could expect with climate change? Vegetation and surface treatment and surface cover of the land is going to be critical going forward. What are some thoughts around just the vegetation, the diversity, the changes that might come to our vegetation biodiversity, our dominant tree species, which have been so important, things like that. So let's spend the last little bit talking about the vegetation on the land and the importance that that link has to salmon, and things we might do to encourage the resiliency of that vegetation.
So from a satellite imagery level, you don't have to be an expert to figure out that Western North America is undergoing landscape scale transformations of vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
From California, or from the Mexican border to the southern interior of BC, we're seeing vast tracts of forest converted by fire into some other vegetational successional pattern. In the species will change. Some of those forests are going to turn into grassland or high montane environments. And with that will come changes in local climate. And with the changes in local climate will come cascading effects that influence the entire species assemblage that exists there, which includes salmon. So the distribution of salmon, there will be salmon in southern BC, there will be salmon for my children and my grandchildren, but the same species and the same abundance levels are not guaranteed, which is why we really need to begin to value ecosystem services to a greater extent than we have historically. We need to tinker intelligently to figure out how to maintain those ecosystem services. But coming back to a point that Nick made, this is about societal values. Society as a whole really needs to be engaged in this, because there will be value judgments about what these ecosystem services are worth to us. A concrete example. In the southern interior, 70% of water supplies are used for agricultural irrigation. Much of that irrigation is for alfalfa and relatively low-value, high-volume crops. We know how, technologically, to use a fraction of the water that we currently use. You just have to go to some place like Israel to look at how they use irrigation in desert environments to know that we could use a fraction of the current consumption to satisfy the needs. But there is an economic price to pay for that. So that's where the societal value judgment has to be made. You have to come back and say, economically, what is this worth to us? And what's that ecosystem service that we would be sustaining also worth? What kind of world are we shaping for our children and grandchildren?
That's an excellent synthesis there. I think that, just further to that, we are challenged in several locations in BC with competing demands for water by humans versus the needs for fish. We're struggling with satisfying the needs of both. And, Pacific salmon, like other fish species, need the right quantity, the right quality, the right water temperature at the right time of year for the right life stage. Access to the spawning grounds by spawners has a bigger flow requirement than summer rearing of juveniles. It's all important, but the competing needs, especially in the changing climate, where we can have longer seasons of drought and more low flow days, adds another level of challenge to a challenge that already exists.
I think speaking to Peter's point and to your original question, I think about the vegetation from a hydrology point of view. The vegetation's really important in terms of the hydrology and the morphology of the stream. Mm-hmm. And the morphology of the stream that tends to regulate fish habitat. So where you will find riffles, where you'll find pools. And we see a legacy of impacts from past practices that result in a loss of riparian vegetation, that result in sediment delivery to the channel, that result in a change in the morphology, that your streams no longer look like they used to. They're no longer formed by the flows which used to flow, which would have been the defining discharges. And the habitat's not the same as what it used to be. You know, loss of shading, widening of the stream channel, infilling of sediment delivery. And it also results in the streams not being able to adjust to the inputs that would originally have been imposed on them naturally. So we have sort of an imposed system from land management side, and then we have a larger issue with climate change where overall flows are changing and things like that. And then to Kim's point is maybe the idea of, like the point was made earlier, of the First Nations having an appreciation of living with the land, that the cultural shift of people having an appreciation that the value of nature or the value of the resource is above all, that we would be less willing to cause damage or overuse a resource for agriculture, or that the cost of upgrading irrigation to modern standards to use very little water would be so important in our society that we would bear the cost very willingly, rather than think hard about whether we want to spend the money and whether the benefit is worthwhile.
I think that's an excellent commentary. I mean, because a lot of this is speaking to values, as Kim was referring to, and I think you're referring to a value set in terms of to support human needs, which is fundamental, and I think we can all appreciate that. But linked to that value system is also then the issue around expectations. Expectations in terms of looking at what we currently see as impacts across our landscapes, and maybe some of the negative trends in certain areas, or as indicated by some of our salmon populations, and saying, well, where do we want to be? Where can we be? Given the environment we're under, given what we do understand, and the things we don't understand in the future, but what we currently understand, particularly as it relates to climate change. And I think it's important to be realistic around those expectations in terms of ecological or watershed recovery and what is possible now, given the history of impacts that we've seen over time, and given what we currently understand relative to the issue around climate change impacts. Is it feasible to see a return in certain salmon populations to numbers as is commonly referred to, being able to walk across the backs of certain stocks of salmon in any given stream? There's a certain ideology associated with that, but is there a practicality with that? Where, again, you look at the values associated with society, linked to the watersheds and what they can contribute, that suite of ecological functions, and where maybe society would like to see improvements in the health of our watersheds and the expectations around that. What fundamentally is achievable? I think these are two issues that kind of go hand in hand, and ones that we, within our field and within our respective disciplines, need to be very considerate of as we move forward. I know in the nature of the work that I do on behalf of government and looking at restorative opportunities for salmon, that those are key considerations for us. The environment, our state of our knowledge, how we look at the landscape and understand the impacts, and the potential to enhance those, quite frankly, is different than what it would have been 40 years ago. I don't think there's any question to that. So these are some of the questions in a more kind of contemporary, mature sense that we need to reflect on as a society and as a field of specialists, discipline specialists, if we're talking about watershed recovery, ecological health, and how that is linked to salmon and salmon trend.
I agree, and I think that, Peter, you mentioned, I think you said, generally, things that are good for salmon are good for people. Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. Kim talked about the importance of how, as a society, to really understand ecosystem services and the benefits that communities in general get from a stream that has salmon in it, right? Neil talked about the importance of really understanding these systems in terms of ensuring that the changes and the fine-tuning we want to make are done with the right purpose and in the right intent and the direction. I agree that I know the work I do on a daily basis, that's one of the things, Nick, we struggle with is the expectation around a healthy stream and biology in that stream. One of the things that I'm a little concerned about with is modern society is so busy now with every day-to-day life, they don't even understand what having an appreciation or even an expectation to go to the local stream and see fish in it, right? So these are some of the challenges I think ahead of us that we need to face, right, is societal change in general to come to expect a healthy watershed. The International Year of the Salmon, our moment of opportunity. All of the issues the panel's discussed, we're going to let each of them individually provide a brief summation of some of the important material we've covered today.
When you think about restoration, think that systems are dynamic and that changes that occur tend to be transient, and what's there today may not be there tomorrow on various different time scales. And a system may not necessarily be restored to its previous state or any previous state, but there may be a future state which is either just as functional or more so, which could be an objective of restorative action.
So some closing thoughts from my perspective in regards to today's discussion, I think that are really important, is the way that humans view, consider the landscape and the actions and impacts of behavior on the landscape, because it's going to be those things that we are possibly able to shift over time. I think fundamentally it is very difficult for individuals to value something that they can't fully appreciate or understand. And I think that's a key part of the role that we play in looking at trying to restore salmon populations and healthy watersheds. And it's a key factor in the work that we do in trying to restore these populations.
So, final thoughts from a societal perspective. One of the things that we really need to do is to elevate our valuation of ecosystem services, which I think historically have been undervalued. We need to learn to design with nature, not just simply extract benefits from nature. And that will take intelligent tinkering. And in the process of intelligent tinkering, we should learn how to do things better. We should also be prepared for surprises, both in forms of success and in the form of failure. But it's the only way to go forward to achieve a sustainable future for both salmon and people.
A takeaway message from me is that sound resource management is preferable to having to go back and restore problems that occurred as a result of something else. For proponents of Pacific salmon habitat restoration, I would say look beyond what you can see standing at streamside. The conditions in the channel are the cumulative effect of all the processes, physical and biological, that are occurring throughout the watershed upstream of that point and adjacent to it. For effective habitat restoration, a sound assessment of the watershed is key. Identify specifically what your problems are. That feeds into sound planning and then into restorative actions that would have a higher likelihood of success than without the preceding two steps.
In this video trilogy series, we've learned about three things: the growing collaboration between local governments and with the stewardship sector, the growing understanding of the various values supported by a healthy functioning watershed, and the renewed focus on supporting protection and informed restoration and enhancement of our rivers and creeks. These are some of the tools we have to do the work we need to do, reconnecting hydrology with ecology in an altered landscape.
Humans are part of nature. We are part of the ecosystem. We have a big effect because there are so many of us. We change the landscape profoundly, but we are still part of it. And from an International Year of the Salmon perspective, and to quote Dr. Kim Hyatt, large efforts on the part of a very large mass of people around the rims of the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, and likely the Arctic Oceans will need to come together for any real change to occur.
In closing, and to quote Peter Tschaplinski, at every scale there are challenges and solutions that are going to need to be embraced. We have the thinking figured out. We can take the lessons learned and bring them back to our regional and local context and inspire people to do better. Looking ahead to 2021 and our program for the 4th annual symposium, we will travel, whether literally or virtually, to the Cowichan Valley to explore and share local and regional experiences of reconnecting hydrology and ecology, the key to water stewardship in a changing climate.